Welcome back, everybody, to our Bible study through the Gospel of Luke. We're going verse by verse. We are in chapter 20 today. We're on the second half, and hopefully we can finish off the chapter today. We're going to cover verses 27 through 48, I think, if I remember how many verses are here. 27 through 47. So 20 verses to cover. Jesus has been kind of in a bit of a battle with a very one-sided battle with the Jewish religious leaders. They've been trying to bring tricky questions to him, try to trip him up, find a reason to accuse him, anything that they can grasp onto to get rid of him. And he's been answering their questions quite masterfully because he knew that they were not genuine questions. And the last question that he dealt with was one about taxes. The Pharisees' disciples had come to him, asked him if they should pay tribute to Caesar, and he had disposed of them quite handily and answered their question. Now the Sadducees, who are another religious sect, come up to Jesus. They have a question about the resurrection, and we'll see here that this question is really based off of their interpretation of God and the afterlife and some of their biases. So we'll get into that. But let's read a good chunk of a section here, verses 27 through 38. And there came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterwards the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as wife." Let me read that again. "In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as wife. And Jesus said to them, The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more, because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." So this passage has a parallel in Mark chapter 12, verses 18 through 27. Let's ask, who were the Sadducees and how did they differ from the Pharisees? I think we've gone over this material before, but if anyone wasn't with us for those previous lessons, I think this is helpful and helpful as a refresher. So who were the Pharisees? Well, they were generally made up of wealthy men who kind of retired from business and turned their attention to religion. They had a lot of influence among the common Jewish people. They promoted a very strict adherence to the Old Testament laws and to the oral traditions of the rabbis that came after the Old Testament laws. They promoted Jewish culture over Greek culture. They believed in the supernatural. They believed in the resurrection and in the afterlife. Now, kind of in contrast to them, there were the Sadducees. And even though these two groups often came after Jesus and they were both his enemies, they were actually enemies of each other too. The Sadducees and the Pharisees, they didn't get along. And part of the reason is explained here. So who were the Sadducees? Well, they were kind of the upper economic class among the Jews. They were like the 1%ers. You contrast that with Jesus' followers, who were mostly common people, maybe even on the poorer side. Not all of them, but many of them. The Sadducees had significant influence with the Romans, who were the governing authorities. They rejected the way that the Pharisees were always binding tradition on people. They viewed the first 5 books of Moses as the binding part of the law, and they dismissed the oral traditions of the rabbis. They were much more friendly to Greek culture and Roman culture, And they had a very limited belief in the supernatural. So they rejected the idea that the body was going to resurrect. They rejected the concept of an afterlife and the concept of angels. And they were responsible for the management of the temple in Jerusalem. So if I understand correctly, there were much fewer Sadducees than there were Pharisees. Pharisees were spread out all over the Jewish world, well, at least in this area of the world where the Jews lived, Galilee, Judea. Seems like they were spread out through that area, but the Sadducees were kind of concentrated in Jerusalem, if I understand correctly. So some of these Sadducees, they approach Jesus and they think that they've come up with a really challenging question. As is mentioned above and in Luke chapter 20, verse 27, the Sadducees rejected the idea that people would resurrect from the grave after death. And so the question that they brought to Jesus was one that they thought was really, really tricky. They seemed to be setting Moses' law against the concept of the resurrection, suggesting that if one was true, the other couldn't be true. So here is their hypothetical question. And to understand it, it's important to know a few things about the Old Testament law. So according to the Old Testament law, when a married man died without having children with his wife, the widow was not supposed to marry again outside of the family. Instead, the brother of the man who died was required to marry his dead brother's widow and have children with her. And the first son in their union was considered the son of the dead brother. So it would serve to carry on his name and his lineage. And this is like a really weird rule for modern day readers. I mean, it would be like if my brother died and had a wife and didn't have any kids, I would be responsible for taking his wife and having kids with her, and then that child, the first child from that union, would belong to my dead brother, right? It's strange, but Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 5 through 10, if you want to read that law. It was a way of preserving the family line, and that was a little bit more important to them back then than it would be in modern day America, at least. The Sadducees, they kind of exaggerated the question, though. They said, well, what if this happens 6 times in a family where there were 7 brothers? So on earth, the widow would have been married to 7 different men. So their question was, who's her true husband? When she resurrects from the dead, who's her husband going to be? And they were kind of assuming that she was going to be married to one of these guys after the resurrection. And they obviously believed that this was like some great dilemma. So really their question was more about whether or not the resurrection was real than it was about, a marriage law. And Jesus knew that, and I think you can see that in his answer. Jesus obviously didn't think that this was a very great dilemma. Their confusion about the issue was due to their fundamental misunderstanding of the marriage relationship and eternity and their failure to look closely at the scriptures. So in 2 short statements, Jesus kind of dismantles this whole false dilemma, and he uses Moses' own record of God's words in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6 to show the Sadducees their foolishness and the foolishness of their view on the resurrection. The first statement that Jesus makes, the question about the woman's true husband following the resurrection was irrelevant because, he said, marriage didn't exist in eternity. And it won't exist in eternity, right? When we go to heaven, the marriage relationship that we have on earth today, that's not a thing. The people that are resurrected, he says, will be like the angels who neither marry or are given in marriage. And it's interesting that Jesus mentions the angels in his response. I think that was definitely intentional because guess what? The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, but they also didn't believe in angels. So Jesus was not so subtly telling them that they were wrong about more than just marriage. They were wrong about the supernatural. They were wrong about angels. He's basically telling them, you're wrong about a lot of stuff. And he's doing this all in one answer. So the second dismantling statement that Jesus uses here in regards to the resurrection, he mentions that God's own words when speaking to Moses out of the burning bush confirmed that the resurrection was real. Exodus chapter 3, verse 5 through 7. Let me read that. It says, Then God said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. You notice here that Jesus chose a text from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and these would have been books that the Sadducees affirmed as being, legitimate and worthy of being respected. And so he takes a source of authority that they would have respected, and he uses it to prove that they were wrong about a lot of other things. This passage that we just read records a conversation between God and Moses when Moses was in Midian. This is often referred to as the burning bush. And when God was talking to Moses in this scene, some of these men that he mentions, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these fathers of the Jewish nation, they had been dead for like 400 plus years. But God didn't say, I was the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God said, I am. Right? And if you know anything about English, you'll know that, I was, that's past tense. Like God used to be their father. God doesn't use the past tense. He says, I am the God of your father, or of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am present tense, which means what? Well, Jesus here is saying that because God used the present tense, what he was implying, what he was stating directly, was that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, he was still their father. They were still alive, which means what? Well, there must have been a resurrection after their death because they were 400 years dead. They didn't just, turn back into dust, and they weren't obliterated after that. God was still watching over them at that point. Jesus indicates that God's words were very specific and they were not chosen accidentally. And so, with these two statements and these 2 points that are made by Jesus, the Sadducees' question is basically mute. Number 1, physical marriage doesn't translate into the spiritual realm or the afterlife. And the resurrection of the dead is a truth that's confirmed by Moses in the scriptures that the Sadducees claim to believe. So there's no contradiction, there's no dilemma that exists here between the commands of Exodus chapter 3 and the resurrection from the dead. So we have again some Jewish leaders coming up to Jesus thinking they're going to thwart him, and Jesus just reveals, look, you guys haven't read the scriptures close enough. So he embarrasses them at their own game. I mean, they're supposed to be the religious experts. He's 30 years old, remember. These guys are probably quite a bit older than he is. They're thought of as the scholars, and here's this somewhat young guy who comes along and shows them that they don't know what they're talking about. You can't deny that this would have had an impact on the people who were standing by, the crowds who were watching this. So let's read verses 39 through 40. And then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well. For they no longer dared to ask him any question. So there's again, kind of a recognition that Jesus' answers were irrefutable. This time from the scribes, who often were associated with the Pharisees. So the crowds were astonished at Jesus' teaching, just like they had been in other places in the scriptures. We read about that in Matthew chapter 22, verse 33. And you think about this question, it might have been a great, the scribes here, they're the one who commend Jesus for this answer about the resurrection. It's not the Sadducees, because they've just been completely put to shame. But the scribes, who my understanding did believe in the resurrection, they were quick to say, "Oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, we agree with you, Jesus. Yeah, good answer on that one," because he had just put their enemies, the Sadducees, to shame. I kind of already mentioned that. Let's see, where do I want to go? Okay, let's jump down and read verse 41 through 44. But he said to them, "How can they say that Christ is David's son?" This is Jesus talking. He's saying to the Jewish leaders standing by, "How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, quote, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord. So how is he his son?" So rather than the Pharisees and the Sadducees asking the questions, Jesus actually had a question of his own for them. And he intended to make it clear to the people that their rulers, their teachers, their rabbis, they were not the experts that they claimed to be. So he asked his critics for their interpretation of a scripture in the Psalms. You would think that this would be kind of their wheelhouse. They'd be able to give an answer for this. If they were the experts, they shouldn't really have a problem, especially considering there were multiple of them versus just one Jesus. Jesus is single-handedly answering all their questions. He's allowing them to put all their minds together in their big old group, and they still can't answer his question. So he just presents this to whoever wants to answer. In Psalm 110, verse 1, David referred to the Christ as Lord. Okay? So this term would have been used to refer to superiority. But how could a father, David, he was born before Jesus, before the Christ, how could a father be inferior to one of his descendants? Because in the Jewish culture, it was very much a patriarchal culture, and the father was more highly respected than the son in almost every case. So how could it be that David, who is Jesus' great whatever grandfather, is calling his far distant relative his Lord, saying he's greater than him? If the Christ was nothing more than a physical descendant of David, then it doesn't make sense for David to refer to him as a superior, right? There must have been something more to the Messiah than just being a physical son of David. In verse 42 and 43, Luke records David's words about the exaltation of the Messiah at the throne of God and how all the things would be subjected to him. So Jesus asked the Jewish scholars how to explain David's comments, and they didn't have any idea how to respond. No one was able to answer him a word, according to Matthew 22, verse 46. So this text suggests that the Jewish scholars, they believed that the Messiah would be a descendant of David, but they didn't take texts like Isaiah 7:14 literally. Isaiah 7:14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Well, the name Emmanuel means God with us. There was something that was the Messiah, this figurehead of the Jews. He was prophesied to be something extraordinary. He was prophesied to be God with us, to be divine. Right? It suggests that the Jews hadn't really connected that idea. Yeah, they thought he'd be a descendant of David, but not the Son of God. If the Jews believed that the Messiah was supposed to be divine, they wouldn't have had any problem answering this question. They would say, oh, well, of course the Messiah is greater than David. Of course he's his Lord, because the Messiah is God. But they couldn't provide an answer. And in stumping his critics, Jesus was doing a few things. Number one, he was opening the minds of the people to the true nature of the Messiah, revealing his true nature to them. And in the second place, obviously, he was humbling the Jewish religious leaders by stumping them with their own scriptures. So the Jewish elite, they had been whipped at this point, and they finally learned their lesson and they retreated. They weren't smarter, they weren't more clever, they weren't wiser, they weren't better students of the law than this 30-year-old guy from Galilee, and they didn't stand any chance against him on the battlefield. At least a battlefield that was governed by reason and civility. So they were done questioning Jesus, and they were going to end up resorting to an uncivilized battlefield, the uncivilized violence of murder. And that's what they were plotting next. Murdering somebody because their pride was so damaged. He shamed them so greatly in front of the people whose affections and admirations they craved, that they just decided they should have gone home and concluded, wow, maybe I should rethink my religious perspective, my theology a little bit. But no, they weren't going to do that. They were going to get rid of the problem once and for all. It shows you how pride can make you irrational. And it can be just like such a destructive force in your life and in other people's lives. Verse 45 through 47 now. And in the hearing of all of the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So this was one of the most, if not the most, severe condemnation that Jesus spoke against the Jewish religious leaders. I think, you can think of like Matthew chapter 23, where almost that whole chapter is dedicated to the woes against the Pharisees and the scribes, right? I think that this is the parallel text to that. Jesus condemns them for their abuse of God's religious system and the way that they applied it to other people and did it terribly and made devotion to God a burden rather than an experience of worship, an experience of devotion, an experience of love. He says, quote, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes. Matthew mentions how the scribes love to be admired by other people for their religious devotion. Matthew 23, verse 5 says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So their religious devotion was motivated by, again, their pride, by their love of other people looking at them and thinking how holy they were. They were more interested in receiving praise from men than they were in giving praise to God. And man, I think there's a lot of application there for us. You can even find that in your own heart sometimes. You'd rather have men praise you than go to the house of God and praise him. And I have down for an application here that this wasn't just a Pharisee problem. This wasn't just a scribe problem. This is an everybody problem. When we've escaped the pride that keeps us outside of Christ, we often then have to begin a new battle with pride inside the church and making sure our heart is doing these things for the right reasons and making sure it isn't wandering off and our motivations aren't changing over time into something that's self-serving rather than something that's God-serving. Satan does a really excellent job at tempting religious people to become proud in their religious devotions. Matthew mentions that the the Pharisees, what does it say? Oh, they make their phylacteries broad. And you might be like, what on earth is a phylactery? It's actually not even mentioned by Luke. And again, that might be the difference between Luke writing to a Gentile audience and Luke writing to a Gentile audience and Matthew writing to a Jewish audience. Matthew mentions the phylacteries. Maybe the Gentiles didn't really know what those were, but the Jews would have, so Matthew mentions them. And I'll mention them here because I think they're kind of interesting. I have two pictures in the notes of phylacteries. You'll see one man, he has it wrapped around his head and around his arm. And it was like it's a little box that had little pieces of parchment inside of it. And on those little pieces of parchment, there were Old Testament scriptures written. And it's thought that the phylacteries were created in response to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 18. Deuteronomy 1:18 says, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." So when you read that verse, you think, okay, that's symbolic, right? He says, lay them up in your heart and on your soul, bind them around your hands and and in front of your eyes, right? Be meditating on these things all the time. And although many of the Jews believe that to be a metaphorical passage, others created these interesting traditions of practicing this in a physical, very real way. So archaeological evidence in places like Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they've confirmed the existence of these phylacteries in the first century, and the phylacteries had two parts. The first was like a small box, and the small box had scriptures in it, and then it was worn on the forehead, frontlets between your eyes. Right? Literally, like, it's sitting on your forehead right in front of you, right? You're not going to miss it. And the second one was this leather band that wrapped around people's forearms. And additional traditions developed around these two items. Debate existed in the Jewish religious community about like the order in which the Torah passages had to be placed inside the phylactery. And there were also rules about like the length of the leather arm strap and how many times it had to be wrapped around your arm. So they were trying to literally have the scriptures in front of their eyes and wrapped around their hands, just like that scripture talked about. And maybe you can see Jesus's problem with the Pharisees, specifically with this tradition. Especially when they got down to arguing about like how many times the leather had to be wrapped around your hand or what order the scriptures needed to be in, right? Christians can fall into the same trap, arguing about these things that don't matter, arguing about these things that God hasn't specified. And these things, these small, insignificant things can become really big deals to us, while God must be in heaven just shaking his head like, wow. These people are wasting so much time. There's so much work that I gave them to do, to evangelize, to care for the widows and the orphans. They could be doing that, but instead they're sitting around talking about how many times you have to wrap a leather phylactery band around your arm, and this phylactery is purely an invention and a too literal interpretation of a verse that I gave them that was clearly meant to be metaphorical. Right? What are they doing down there, God is saying. So you can see, and before you laugh at the Pharisees, if you've ever been a part of a church, you've probably seen things like this come up, where traditions and rules around those traditions become more important than doing the work that God gave us to do. We all have to be careful about that. That isn't a first century, isn't just a first century problem, that's an everybody problem. Matthew also mentions these fringes that were around their garments. And This is probably referring back to a command that was given to the people of Israel in Numbers chapter 15, verse 37. Moses told the Israelites that they were supposed to put a cord of blue on the tassel, or on the text says, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of every corner of their garments. And this was just supposed to be a sign of their heritage. And so they had these long tassels. They like to wear these long robes. Some people suggest that they like to make their tassels really, really long because they they would stand out more. It's supposed to be a sign of their devotion, whatever, right? Again, kind of these meaningless traditions. Well, not meaningless. This was one that God commanded them to do, but here they were using it to earn praise for themselves instead of the intention that God originally designed it for. God told the Jews to wear these blue tassels to remind them of his commands. And apparently the Pharisees and the scribes, they had made theirs especially large to indicate their respect for God. They had extra respect for God's commands because their tassels were extra long. Therefore, they would remember God's commands the best. I suppose that was the thought behind it. And I feel like this is a little bit redundant, but there were early rabbinic traditions which specified the types of strings which needed to be dyed blue on the tassels, and the types of dye that were supposed to be used. And some of the rabbis even cursed people who used cheap dye alternatives rather than using like the real deal. I mean, blue dye back in those days would have been pretty expensive. So, shame on you people who dye your tassels with cheap blue dye, right? That's what they cared about. It's not hard to see why Jesus was mad at these scribes and these Pharisees. They cared so much about their tassels. They cared so much about their phylacteries. They cared so little about the poor. They cared so little about the sick. They cared so little about people's souls. The Pharisees and the scribes, they weren't concerned at all for the weightier matters of the law. Yeah, we've talked about that. Maybe I should stick to my notes a little bit closer instead of overlapping myself. I kind of already did this application. Well, let me just read this very quickly in the way of application. It's possible to be surrounded by religious practices and scriptural study and yet have no affection for God. The Pharisees, they did this every day. They had scriptures wrapped around their arm and their forehead, and they had reminders of God's law hanging from the corners of their clothing. But they didn't love God at all, and they didn't know God at all. And we should keep this in mind. I mean, consider a child who grows up in a strong church with godly parents. They grow up attending Bible class, reading the Bible, practicing for church activities. That could be anything. Singing, praying. And people look at them and they admire them and they say, oh, what a good Christian young person this is. He's always at church. He's always participating, always involved. And then as soon as that kid leaves the house, their faith evaporates. Have you ever seen that happen? It's like they almost never believe the things that you thought that they believed. All the things that they affirmed, all the religious things that they said, all the religious practices, it's like it didn't actually sink in. Well, how does that happen? Well, because they were good at religious practice, but the deeper meaning behind the practices were never appreciated. A person could be surrounded by beauty and never appreciate it. A person can be surrounded by people who love God and yet never learn to appreciate God for themselves. A person can go through the motions by observing somebody can go through the motions, but just because they go through those emotions and you observe them doing it, it doesn't actually reveal anything about the state of their heart. So the Pharisees were kind of in that situation, and we need to recognize that as well, that there is a difference between external action and devotion of the heart. And if we did recognize that, I think we would be better at saving some of those people who wander off away from Christ as soon as they leave the house. And a lot of times we're content if somebody shows the outward actions of being a, quote, good Christian. But if we were really getting down to people's hearts and doing the evaluation on that level, which takes more time, takes more committed mentoring, committed parenting, if we spent the time to do that, we would hold on to more people. Jesus also said that the scribes liked greetings in the marketplace. And you might think, well, what's wrong with somebody greeting you in the marketplace? This must have been more than just like a simple hello. These greetings must have in some ways indicated the scribes' importance. The scribes were people of importance in the community, and they must have savored the fact that they could go down to the marketplace and people would recognize them and they would greet them as such. He said that the scribes loved to have seats of honor at feasts and in the synagogues. And again, this was just a constant need for recognition. Their egos were their interest, and their motivating, their egos guided them. And Jesus advised them on this issue back in Luke chapter 14, verse 10, where he told them not to take the best seats at feasts, but clearly they hadn't really put his words into application. So they were still claiming the best positions for themselves. It says that they devoured widows' houses. I mean, this was a very serious accusation under the law of Moses. The Psalms refer to God as being a protector of widows. But these Jews had been using God's name to abuse widows. Psalm chapter 68, verse 5. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. Deuteronomy 27, verse 19. Cursed be anyone who perverts the justice due to the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. And all the people shall say, Amen. So God took that very seriously, and here Jesus was accusing these guys of doing that very thing. Finally, Jesus mentioned how they made, it says, quote, for pretense made long prayers. Pretense is not a word that I use a lot, so I had to look it up. Synonyms for pretense include trick, con, sham, hoax, and fabricate. So he says that they made long prayers for pretense. Their prayers were fake. They were intended to communicate more to men than they were to communicate to God. They prayed for a really long time to make others believe that they were extra holy. And I don't know, maybe you know somebody who, or maybe you've done that before. I think I can't remember a specific time, but I think I've probably done that before. You know, you pray a really long prayer because you want to look like you're just, such a person of prayer. Jesus said that they will receive the greater condemnation. There are sinners who are selfish and prideful and extortioners and blasphemers and liars and thieves and all kinds of other things. But then there are sinners who are selfish and prideful and extortioners and blasphemers and liars and thieves, and they use God's name as a way to mask their intentions, maybe even to try to justify their actions. And it's to those people that Jesus was saying they were going to receive the greater condemnation. Their punishment was going to be harsher because of the positions that they occupied, because of the privileges that had been afforded to them to know the God of the Scriptures, and yet they didn't know him. They were privileged to be in a special relationship with God as his children, and as his people and as his nation, and to be protectors of the things of God and the temple and the holy things and the Jewish law, but they were abusing it all, and Jesus was upset with them. So this concludes chapter 20. Really just the whole chapter, beginning with the parable of the wicked tenants, coming down all the way here to Jesus' final condemnations. It's really just a statement about where the Jewish religious leadership was and the trouble that their nation was in. Because keep in mind, these guys had been guiding everybody else supposedly in the ways of God, and they were failing colossally. So why do we need Jesus to come and to save the world? Why did the first century Jews need Jesus to come and to save them and to be a part of a better kingdom? Well, it's pretty clear after you read a chapter like this, and it just becomes even clearer as we progress and finish off the book. So that's chapter 20. It's like 11 p.m. here. Not sure that was the most clear study I've ever done in my life, but thanks for hanging with me. If you're still with me after, 41 minutes, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow, Lord willing. We will jump into chapter 21, which that'll be a fun one. All right, see you guys later.